This is Kim Hammer with your devotion taken from 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning with verse 18. Some additional thoughts to yesterday's devotion. One of the first things we recognize is in verse 20, where David said, "For you know your servant." The one thing that David understood was that he was a servant to God, and God was not a servant to him. The second thing out of that statement is that David understood that God knew more about him than David knew about himself. If God knows when we are going to be born, even before we're conceived, and when we're going to die, He's got everything figured out in between, and David understood that. And once David got himself in a position that he understood that he was a servant to God and not expect God to serve him, and when David realized that God knew more about him than David knew about himself, he began to change his attitude and conform with what would be stated in God's word and according to his will. That's why when you move down to verse 21, it says, "For the sake of your word and according to your will." We need to live for the sake of God's word. We don't need to be changing God's word in order that our lifestyle can conform to something outside of God's word. Instead, what we need to do is change our lifestyle and change who we are in order to conform to God's word, because God's word changes not. God is not going to change his word to accommodate a lifestyle or to accommodate a choice that a sinful man makes just to make him feel better. Instead, God is going to hold fast to his word. He's going to protect his word because he knows that his word is truth, and the truth will set you free. The second part of that is that it is regarding according to the will of God. God has a will for each one of us, and our job is to pray and ask God to bring us into an understanding of what God's will is for our life. Many times people pray and say, "God, change your will," or they imply that they want God to change his will for their life to conform to what they want. The reality is that as God's children, being servants, as already brought out, that what we need to do is change our life to conform to the will of God. Because if he knows us better than we know ourselves, and if he already has a predetermined will for our life, we would want to conform to that will, because we know that God's will never takes us in the wrong direction. If we're going in the wrong direction in life, it's not because the will of God sent us that way. It's because we have broken away from the will of God, and we have purposely chosen to go a different direction than what a servant should against the master. God's word is true, and it stands forever, and it changes for no one, and he has a will for our life. Our job is to conform to the will of God. Jesus even displayed this in the book of Luke chapter 22 and verse 42 when he said, "Father, if you're willing to take this cup away from me, nevertheless not my will, but your will be done." He wasn't asking God to change his will for his life. What he was asking God is, "Help me conform to what your will for my life is." The responsibility of change is on the part of us, the servant, not on the part of God, our master, because he has a perfectly designed will for our life. And if we will conform to it and seek it according to his word, we will find ourselves in a blessed position like David was. David also acknowledged in verse 21 that you have done great things, O Lord. You and I do great things in life, but we'll never do great things greater than what God is able to do. So everything that we do should be with the intent of reflecting what a great God we serve. And then the last thing is this, in verse 23, David also acknowledged that Israel was the only nation on earth that God went out to redeem himself. Not the United States of America, not any other nation on the face of the earth. We are all expendable, but the one nation that is not expendable is the nation of Israel that God went out to redeem himself. It is in our own best interest that we stand by Israel, because those that stand by Israel are receiving the blessings of God. Those who come against Israel will experience the wrath of God, because we are expendable and Israel is not. Pray that you have a great day.